maybe significantly. And I want to talk about issues of big data and identity. And one of the things I've been thinking about as I've been listening to the talks today is how we're speaking about that we have big data, and we're talking about big data as tools for us to do things. And big data out of which we extract patterns largely over people. And what I've been thinking about for a long time is the fact that big data not only are, but historically have been, at least one aspect of it, intensively about individuals. That big data about individual people, whether identifiable or not, is a heck of a lot of what big data are. Not about buildings, not about medical devices, not about sales, but about the things that each one of us are doing in our online activities. So along with many of my colleagues from FIMS, I think about big data from a very different perspective. I'm thinking about big data as being data not only generated by, but fundamentally about individual people. And it's stuff like, and we can come up with the list, who we're connected to, what kind of content of messages we send, where we move, what we buy, what we look at online, where we bank, what our banking activities are. The metadata that's been of such great interest lately, given Snowden's, not latest, but revelations of not so long ago about how the Canadian government are tracking the metadata of our online communications if we've been using free airport Wi-Fi. So this is stuff about us, about our online activities. Pardon? Why not? I have no idea. There we go. Okay. Yes. All right, there you go. Yeah, I was thinking you, not at that. Okay, so it's big data about people. Things like mobility data is becoming increasingly important. And one of the things that we have to recognize about this is while these data are not identifiable in the traditional sense, and it has some interesting implications for regulatory frameworks, they are absolutely and quickly unique and individuating. That is, they are let's see, individuating is perhaps the best way to put it, that these data, while they may not be associated with an individual specifically in the world, i.e. me, nonetheless will be unique to me very quickly. And once you have a unique trace, and for these location data, if you track people as they move around the world, it takes something like 5 points on a regular basis, you know, where someone is at 5, generally is at 5 times during a typical day, you can uniquely identify that person. You can that's a unique movement trace that can be quickly associated with an individual person. We know about the kind of behavioral tracking that this supports has been around for a heck of a long time. Long before we started talking about big data, behavioral advertising has been around for ages. It's one of the consequences of these kinds of this kind of behavioral monitoring. And in fact, it's a positive consequence. My son gets really pissed off if I use his computer because the ads are no longer his ads. And each one of us, in fact, benefits from the consequences of, the implications of this kind of tracking. But that's not the only that's not the only use, and even on its own, perhaps not a non-problematic use of these kinds of behavioral tracking data. One of the things we need to understand is that the data that are being collected are both collected visibly and invisibly. People understand what they're contributing to the network, and in many cases do not understand and do not even know what we're contributing. And in fact, data are being contributed on our behalf. These data can be mined to reveal private traits, things that we haven't revealed, perhaps even, well, certainly haven't revealed explicitly through answering a questionnaire, for example, but maybe not even implicitly. So they can be mined to reveal things like political affiliations. They can be mined to reveal things like sexual orientation. And this is a paper that came out in Nature not all that long ago, that the data traces, the data crumbs that we leave behind us as we traverse the web reveal far more about us than we have any way of being aware of. They support surveillance that goes far beyond what we know we're being surveyed on. So if you recognize that as we move around physically in the world, as we move around online, we are leaving behind us a very detailed trace of all of our online activities that can be integrated across many data sources potentially, and increasingly as our data analytic capacities increase, and can be integrated with information that's collected from sensors that are out there in the world, cameras, as Hanan pointed out, being a really important example. So supporting a kind of surveillance that perhaps we have never contemplated, and moreover, and very importantly, that supports a retrospective surveillance. Andrew Clement at the University of Ontario, University of Toronto, has demonstrated pretty conclusively that, and many of you probably already know, that most of the internet traffic that goes through the US is monitored at mirrored at one of 9 sites and archived, and those archives support not forward-looking surveillance, but retrospective surveillance, which is something that we need to consider. They allow, of course, for predictive targeting. So one thing, you can look backwards on my behavioral traces, or at my behavioral traces, to figure stuff out about me. We're starting to see a looking forward, kind of in a minority report kind of way. The Chicago police force is not only identifying on the basis of these kinds of individuated data, hotspots within Chicago where crimes might be likely to occur, which sounds like a good thing because we can improve policing there, but also identifying heat lists of individuals who, on the basis of predictive filtering, are deemed as being likely to participate in criminal activity. So they're going in and they're intervening with these people prior to any kind of activity on the basis of what is fundamentally and only correlational evidence. That's it. They don't have anything else, because that's all of what this data analytics is over. I've said that these data don't generate a lot of protection, and they don't. At least a lot of legal or regulatory protection, because legal and regulatory protections have been focused on so-called identifying data: name, address, telephone number, IP address, things that can connect the data to an individual, a physical individual, and a person in the world. But we're starting to get it that there are privacy consequences of these. So we see in the US and in Canada, to a certain extent, motivation for direction towards do not track legislation, which will allow people to opt out, it's a problematic approach, or more ideally, opt into this kind of behavioral tracking. In the EU, there's a kind of a different perspective taken on this, a different level of protection that adheres to these kinds of data. And in the EU, you've seen some years ago a move towards the right to be forgotten, that we have a right, that in the EU they're motivating a right not only to preclude the collection of this kind of data, but actually the right of people to go and say, look, you can no longer remember who I am. The issue is, as we see it, as I think about it, is that we are leaving behind us an increasingly detailed digital shadow that we don't even know we're producing, that has implications for who we can be in the world. I've done some work on identity and thinking about the notion of autobiographical memory and the ability to tell one's own story. And the fact of the matter is that my ability to tell my own story, to represent myself as I choose to represent myself in the world, even if you consider that to be a somewhat problematic right or a problematic ability, nonetheless we rely on the ability to tell our own stories, to remember what's important to us, and more importantly to forget the things that are less important to us. And the existence of this increasingly detailed digital shadow really compromises that ability. I can no longer tell my own story if all of this detailed information about who I am, what I've done, where I've been is available to anyone with the analytic and access capability to say something different, to tell a different story about me. Another consequence is that these digital shadows are creating for us and around us an invisibly shaped information environment. It's not just our advertising that's being shaped. It's the results of our search engines. It's the things that are recommended, the music that's recommended to us, or the films that are recommended to us. They're increasingly, the predictive analytics over the kinds of data traces that I leave behind are influencing the world that I encounter online and possibly offline, as well as mobile devices are increasing. So the advertisements that I encounter as I move around the world on my cell phone, and that's true for me, it will be astoundingly true for my son. Cultural products are now being driven by predictive analytics. So the apocryphal story right now is about House of Cards, which is a Netflix production produced as a result of and specifically on the back of analytics that looked at the kinds of things that Netflix observers, Netflix audience were interested in seeing them. Now, on the one hand, you can say that's delivering to audiences exactly what they want to see. But you have to be concerned about whether the end result will be, almost certainly will be, a constriction or restriction of the popular cultural environment that surrounds us. It's not going to restrict what we potentially have access to, but I think has a great deal of implication for what we in practice have access to, because it's going to be harder and harder to find those things that are further and further outside of the popular culture bubble. There's also the issue of corporate ownership and control. Who owns my data? I don't actually own it. The stuff that I produce, I don't own. And this has actually been tested long before this in Supreme Court cases which say, for example, and to me quite astoundingly, that the pharmacist who fills my prescriptions owns the data about the drugs that I'm prescribed, the dosages that I take, how often they're prescribed to me. So long as those data are dissociated from my particular identifiers, I actually don't own the information. I find that astounding. It's becoming increasingly true. So I think it's really critical, really important, that we take a critical perspective on especially this kind of social, this kind of big data about people. That we document data collection practices, and these are extremely difficult to identify. I've been involved in a project in the last year funded by the Privacy Commissioner of Canada where we're looking at behavioral tracking, straightforward behavioral tracking on consumer health information websites. Astounding to me, absolutely astounding to me, that many, if not most of these sites where consumers are going to go to look up arguably very personal and potentially highly sensitive information are tracking not only first-party tracking but third-party tracking and aggregating over multiple sites and therefore potentially sharing data across multiple sources. So we need to document these kinds of data collection practices. We need to understand what our attitudes are towards these kinds of practices. Us as members of, as individuals, as members of communities, as participants in a culture, we need to think about what kind of monitoring we want to allow, how we feel about the monitoring that's going on, what sorts of regulatory frameworks we want to have in place. It's raising fundamental and new issues of digital literacy that we as individuals and as a society need to understand the kinds of monitoring practices and procedures and strategies that are in place, the sorts of analytics that are being applied over those data, the kinds of privacy risks that they entail, the ways in which algorithms are shaping our information and other environments. These issues are now fundamental matters of digital literacy. It's no longer, it's not an esoteric issue. We need to understand these things. And finally, we need to inform and quite frankly develop policy and regulatory frameworks that work to monitor, to regulate, to control this kind of data collection about us as individuals, the kinds of analytics that I've been talking about that are applied over our data, in order that these data contribute to a world that we are comfortable being part of, and not one that sort of happened to us. I was struck by something that Adam said earlier, and I think it's really important to take it into account. He said something like, well, I wrote it down. What did he say? He said something like, oh yeah, that he was pointing to his code. He said, we're going to start to collect data from, he says, wearable devices before we know what to do with it. Well, I think we're already there, and we can strike the phrase from wearable devices. We are collecting all kinds of data before we know what to do with it. And I think we need, and the work that we do at FIMS is largely to think about, we need to understand what data are being collected. We need to think about what the implications of that collection are, and we need to ensure that both the collection and use of that data meets our needs as individuals and as a community, in order that big data are going to do what big data can do really well, which is all the fabulous stuff that we've been talking about up until now.
Yeah. Sure, go for it. I want to say, it's not about you, it's about you as an individual who falls into whatever is wrong with you. And the violence we take with pharmacists is much more than you, because they can track what happens with the prescription. What goes right, what goes wrong. How do you balance this? I find that the issue of privacy fascinating and more than the creation of the business. But the difficulty of information and the other information is huge, and how do we argue about it?
Look, I think that's a fundamental question. My point was not that I think pharmacists should not own that data. I actually was shocked. When I heard about that case, I was working with a lawyer on a completely different project on AI, and she was describing the case to me, and I said, well, of course I own my prescription data. It's my prescription data. And the answer was, the Supreme Court ruling was, I don't own it. And this, to me, was an intuitive shock. And I'm not saying that the position that the Supreme Court took is wrong, and the aggregate value of that data is probably far greater than the value to me individually. But I can tell you that as an individual participating in the production of that data set, I was really surprised to learn that I don't own it. I have no financial interest in it, but I have no other kind of interest in that data. And that seems perhaps not wrong, but shocking to me. So I think these are the conversations we need to have.
Okay, our last speaker before we have a health break and time to look at the posters again is Andrew Nelson, who is an associate professor and associate dean of research at the Faculty of Social Sciences. He's going to talk about some of his award-winning work on paleovisualization of mummies and big data from Egypt.
So, and now for something completely different. So what I'm going to describe for you now in my next few minutes is a fairly recent transition into big data in the field of archaeology and anthropology. And it's sort of interesting listening to Cameron's paper and that sort of stuff. And at the end, I'm going to close where we should be going. But we're really sort of taking baby steps into the big data world. But it's fun, it's exciting. So I work on mummies. Mummies. Why do we care about mummies? What is our fascination with mummies? And they're a little scary. We like to go to mummy movies and things like that. They're from an exotic land, and that's cool to think about pyramids and stuff like that. But really, the key is mummies are part of our history. As archaeologists, we're concerned with the collective past of humankind. We are here and we are who we are today because of what has happened in the past. And be it Peru, be it Egypt, be it Mesopotamia, wherever, we as archaeologists seek to understand the life ways of people from the past. We want to understand their cultural perspectives. We want to understand their biology. We want to understand the health problems that they had. We want to understand their family structure. We want to understand as much as we can about them. And really, mummies are a little microcosm. They're people, right? So we can identify with them very readily. That's what kids love to zoom into the mummy display at the museum, and because they're looking at people, right? And so the mummies are vessels of biological and cultural data. So how do we go about studying mummies? Well, in the past, mummies have been studied by doing what's called a mummy autopsy, or an unrolling. And here's Belzoni from the 1700s, basically ripping apart a mummy and going for amulets and stuff like that inside the wrappings. And these were quite popular throughout the States and Europe to have these mummy unrolling events. And this is a more modern version of it. This was the autopsy of Nocht, a mummy at the Royal Ontario Museum in the 1970s. And there's Nocht to begin with, and this is what's left of him at the end. And so this particular autopsy was highly informative. There were biochemists involved and histologists and radiologists and all this sort of, so they created a great deal of data out of this autopsy. But what you have in the end is a ripped apart mummy. And so when subsequent technology comes along, it's impossible to go back and actually re-examine our friend Nocht. So moving towards the modern world and moving very much in concert with developments in medical imaging, it seems every time there's a new development in medical imaging, the first thing that they do is look at a mummy, and that goes right from the invention or the discovery of X-rays by Röntgen back in the late 1800s. So this is Nocht's brain, and it was the first mummy bit to be CT scanned. And CT scanning obviously brings to us the ability to look inside the wrappings of the mummy non-destructively to see what's going on inside. So the adoption of the availability of CT scanning was a huge leap forward for mummy studies. In my own personal work, I've been doing X-rays for quite a while on mummies, and this is the Chatham mummy. I don't know if any of you know, there's an Egyptian mummy about an hour west of here. And then in 2002, we got Cleo, we refer to affectionately, into the scanner at St. Joe's. And modern clinical scanners are not, you know, they want to do your head or your heart or something like that. We want to do these mummies from head to toe. And so, first of all, the St. Joe's scanner threw up when we got to about the knees. It just kind of shut down. We had to back up. Now the scanners are much more capable than that. But so we're producing data sets, you know, with these, you know, half-millimeter slices from head to toe. 3,000 slices, something like that, that are much bigger than typical clinical CT data sets. And one of the things that I get really excited about when I look at this stuff is that I can take the scans, I can segment out individual bones, and then I can play with the bones on the computer. This is a pelvis. As a bioarchaeologist, I can look at that, and I can twist it around, look at the subpubic angle, look at the sciatic notch, and say this belonged to a female. Okay. And so just with X-rays and stuff like that, that's impossible to do. But until very recently, we've very much been stuck in what's called a case study approach. Go out there, bring the Chatham mummy in here, scan the Chatham mummy, say, yes, this is a woman, she was sort of in middle age, and, you know, do what we call an osteobiography, tell a little bit about the story of this individual mummy. And so this is the Chatham mummy. There's a little bit about some mummies that we did from the ROM. That's all well and good, but they're very much case studies. And case studies invariably underestimate variability. And let me give you a quick case study in variability, and a very famous one. And any of you know anything about mummies probably know that Herodotus, the Greek historian, described the process of mummification. And he described that, you know, and this is the description that's in any textbook on Egypt or any kid's thing about mummies, is they stuck things up through their nose and they mushed up the brain and got the brain out. They did an incision along the left flank, took the organs out there, and usually they left the heart in the chest and took the rest of the organs out, put them in a canopic jar. So that's the perfect mummy. That's what mummification is. Well, just the first few scans that we did made us realize, oops, it's a lot more complicated than that. There's a lot more going on. This is our own Lady Hudson, who resides quietly over in the social science building. She had her brain removed through her nose. That's fine. This is the UCAM mummy. She had her brain actually removed through the foramen magnum, through the base of the skull. And this is Justine, one of the raw mummies, and they didn't take out her brain at all. So is this just something weird? Do I just happen to pick the unusual mummies, or is this something real? And so what do you do when you're faced with a question like that? You put a graduate student on it. And so I had a doctoral student for his dissertation look at patterns of variability in mummification practices. And lo and behold, the practice of removing the brain through the nose varied a great deal over time, very rare early on, and very common later on, which happened to be the period that Herodotus was describing. So, you can't generalize then from Herodotus' description. So we've got to move beyond the case study approach. So how do we do that? So we collect lots of mummies. Well, the problem with that is mummies are all over the place. They're all over the world. They've been spread, every museum had to have one, so they're everywhere. But lots of those mummies that are all over the place have been X-rayed or CT scanned. So we've got a potential to gather them there. But CT scans are large scans. They're very format specific, and they require particular database architecture and computing power to work with it. So this is where we move into big data land. And so now, with different kinds of imaging modalities that are available to us, we can capture data sets of mummies and anything that vary between 3 and 30 gigabytes per individual. Okay. In fact, using our micro CT scanner of sustainable archaeology, I did Lady Hudson's head alone, and that was 30 gigabytes. And so the number of mummies that are around the world are certainly in the hundreds, probably in the thousands. So we're talking many, many, many terabytes worth of data. And again, this requires a very specific kind of system to work with as a database. And visualization, you can't do this with Photoshop, right? You can look at one slice in Photoshop, but you require sophisticated 3D imaging software in order to be able to do this. So the solution is to rip off what the radiologists do in the hospital, and that's to put together what's called a PACS, a Picture Archive Communication System, which takes in all the data, it sort of archives it, and it has a router, and then it can port it out to radiologists. That's fine. But PACS are generally hospital or clinic specific, and in fact, when I even floated the idea of putting mummies on PACS at the hospital, they refused to even talk to me. So patient privacy obviously being the key concern there. Right? So the solution to the problem to the solution to the problem to the solution is to set up my own internet-based, research-specific, i.e. non-patient-based PACS. And it needs to be internet-based for reasons I'll tell you in a sec. And the solution we opted with is a Montreal company, this ORS visualization company. And this is a project called the Internet-Based Mummy Picture Archive Communication System, or IMPACT. And the key concepts here, it's collaborative. We seed it with our own studies. That's some of the ones that we've done anyway. And we're encouraging colleagues at institutions from around the world then to contribute theirs. And so now we currently have data for about 96 human mummies, 25 animal mummies, and we've got promises for quite a bit more. And so this is basically what it looks like. So we're seeding it with our data. We're getting data from places like the British Museum. It's Pretoria down the bottom, and then with the system makes it available to researchers, anybody who's got a internet access. And so this is the informatics part. Okay. ORS has a PACS database, and this is something actually that is very problematic because my scans were scanned at all kinds of different systems now, and the data is all in slightly different format or slightly different orders and presentation and stuff. So I'm working to kind of squunch it all together. We have a SQL database going along with it that has context, so date, place of discovery, different kinds of contextual information of the mummy. And then this is a visualization aspect. So this is a system that your physician would see, right? So you get your 3D rendering and the reconstructions of the slices in three different orientations. So what's going on here is this now is transforming mummy studies, leaving the case study approach behind, and giving us access to large numbers of individual data sets so that we can even start to talk about doing epidemiological studies. And my colleagues in the States recently been doing work, and they're using IMPACT now to look at atherosclerosis, which happens to, we think of it as the Big Mac disease now, but it turns out that it's actually quite common, even in ancient mummies. From a cultural perspective, we're interested in tracking mummification practices and their changes, the dynamics of ancient civilizations, how they change across space and time. And we can even start to link up. You know, there are mummies that probably were originally from the same site, but whoever dug up the site or looted the site or whatever distributed them to different museums. We can start to recollect mummies from different kinds of sites. Issues are computing storage and memory capability, and particularly in terms of the graphics processing units. And rather than patient privacy, my problem is intellectual property. And a lot of people, having scanned their mummy, they don't want to give up the data. And so that's something I've been working with the contracts people, and we've got our own little contributor license agreement for that. And data format compatibility. For the most part, there is an industry-wide DICOM standard, but give or take. So it is all about big data now. Thinking about what Cameron was talking about, you know, now this is still individual operator focused. We got a big data set, but we need to start thinking about how can we distribute, how to do different kinds of analyses with these guys. But it's all about teamwork, right? This involves lots of different people. I had one poster at a conference once that had 30 co-authors on it. And it's all about collaborations. That's the only thing that really makes this kind of work possible. So thank you.
Maybe time for one question for Andrew.
Hello?
Maybe not. How many mummies are there in museums?
Well, I have information on a couple hundred, but I know there are more, and I would estimate in the thousands. Yeah. Well, and private collections. There's a guy in Toronto who tried to donate 2 to us. Couldn't quite make that happen. But
So are these like in total or like
these are just Egyptian ones I'm talking about. But actually, I mean, ultimately, I want to expand this to all mummies. And there are mummies literally from every continent except Antarctica. Original mummies, not Egyptian mummies. So.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. And join me again in thanking all our speakers. Okay, we have a health break now, which we're going to extend, so we have the full 30 minutes. Return here at 4:15. There's coffee, cookies, and beverages as well. Please check out the posters and our sonification display over in this room. So take the time to look at all those, please. So 4:15.